Great.
Hey, everybody. My name's Adam. I'm one of the members of the executive board of the Virginia Worker, and just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. This is our first event of the year and our first event ever as the Virginia Worker. This is just going to be one of many events to come, and we hope you will continue to join us as we host guest speakers presenting on a range of topics covering the history of the Virginia working class and other relevant topics for Virginia workers. Our goal as the Virginia Worker is to build a distinctly pro-worker and independent ideological pole of attraction for the Virginia working class that otherwise does not exist. We're comprised of groups across the state who emphasize organizing workers independently from capitalist parties and their auxiliary organizations, which promote a class collaborationist agenda to the detriment of Virginia workers. Our website is meant to popularize the struggles, campaigns, reports, and debate across the state affecting Virginia workers. We welcome all contributions that fall in line with our mission statement, which you can find at thevirginiaworker.com. Before we begin tonight's presentation, we would like to let all participants know that our next event will be on February 24th at 7 p.m. as we host union organizer and author Joe Burns as he presents his new book, Class Struggle Unionism. Yeah, I think you know Joe there, Peter. We'll have more information on this event in the coming days, to be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram for those updates as we report what's going on for workers across the state. We would also like to cover some ground rules for tonight and how things will flow. Dr. Rachleff will provide his presentation, and then we'll follow with a Q&A. If you'd like to ask him a question, please type it in the Zoom chat box, and we'll read your questions off to Peter. If you can't attend the entire event, we will also post a recording of it online after tonight. And I'm going to introduce Peter here now. Peter considers himself to be a child of the 60s. He grew up in New London, Connecticut, where he was deeply touched by the civil rights, anti-Vietnam War, and movement for labor rights. Peter went to college in Massachusetts, where he became involved with Root and Branch, which produced a magazine and pamphlets. He attended graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh, where he studied with famed labor historian David Montgomery. Peter moved to St. Paul in 1982 to begin a career at Macalester College, where he taught immigration, labor, and African-American history until 2012. His approach to labor history, teaching, research, and writing includes direct involvement in the labor movement. And in 1985-86, he co-chaired the Twin Cities Local P9 Solidarity Committee, which organized support for the Hormel strikers. And he played a similar role on behalf of the Northwest Airline mechanics who struck in 2005 to 2006. He is the author of Black Labor in Richmond, Hard Pressed in the Heartland, and Starving Amidst Too Much, and numerous articles in scholarly and popular journals. In 2013, Peter left to Macalester to found the East Side Library, Freedom Library, as a center for resources and programs which inspire solidarity, work for justice, and advocate equity for all. Today, with support from unions, foundations, and more than 1,600 generous individuals, ESFL houses more than 26,000 books focused in labor, immigration, and social justice movement history, and works with the New Brookwood Labor College, Metro State University, the St. Paul Public Schools, the National History Day program, and other educational ventures. More of these works can be found online and are taking place online. We encourage you to visit eastsidefreedomlibrary.org and their Facebook page for more information. And now I'm going to pass it over to you, Peter.
Okay, and I'm going to try sharing my screen. This? Really?
Yes.
Hang on. That wasn't.
Stop sharing.
Stop sharing. Okay. Let's try it again. I don't think that's it.
Yes. Select, but then you have to go with it.
Oh. Okay. Hang on. Now, hit this. This is
what happened there.
No. From down here, maybe.
This.
Oh, it's here. Oh, here we go. Okay, and now slideshow. Okay. Can you see that okay, everybody?
Looks good.
Okay, here we go then. So one of the things that I thought of in preparation for tonight was all of this hubbub in the state of Virginia and elsewhere about getting critical race theory out of the schools. And those who have been arguing against what they're calling critical race theory say that it's meant to make white kids feel bad. And I wanted to, name tonight's talk In Search of Solidarity, because a big part of what I want to emphasize is that what's also being shut down are stories and a history of workers in solidarity with each other, of African American and white workers organizing together, immigrants and native-born workers organizing together, men and women organizing together, and that's a history that the wealthy and powerful do not want young people to learn. So this seems very appropriate here or there where you are in Virginia, where this statue of Robert E. Lee, I argue, was created in order to erase solidarity between Black and white workers, and in order to erase the history of that solidarity, which had threatened power in Richmond and in the state of Virginia in the late 1880s. As you all know, that statue became a wonderful site of what my old mentor, George Rawick, would have called working class self-activity. People found it to be a space where they could express themselves. And it also became a space of great creativity with the use of projections and more creativity, and this just amazing sense of involvement and power that this statue became the center of. And so what I've been trying to argue in my book, Black Labor in Richmond, which is now, hard for me to believe, almost 40 years old, and in my interventions around this statue and the movement to demand that the statue be taken down, that I've wanted to emphasize that Richmond, Virginia, renowned or reviled as the capital of the Confederacy, renowned or reviled as the center of opposition to school integration in the 1950s and 1960s, that Richmond, Virginia had actually seen one of the greatest expressions of interracial labor solidarity in the history of the United States. And I suggest that there is nowhere in Richmond, no plaque, no markers, no monuments. There's nothing being taught in the schools. This is not something that is part of the known history that the working class of the 21st century carries with them. So I want to share some of that history with you tonight, explain how it was possible, and explore with you how it became erased. So at the center of this story was a remarkable labor organization that called itself the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor, which began in the late 1860s and reached its peak in 1886 the same year that it had such a significant impact in Richmond. This was the slogan. That is the most perfect government, in which an injury to one is the concern of all. Those of you involved here this evening who might be active with the IWW or aware of the IWW know that the IWW modified this slogan to say an injury to one is an injury to all. The Knights of Labor were the first labor organization in the United States to take in African Americans as well as whites, unskilled workers as well as skilled workers, immigrants as well as the native born, women as well as men. Richmond was a great fulcrum for the Knights of Labor. There's a wonderful book by my friend Rob Weir called Beyond Labor's Veil, The Culture of the Knights of Labor. It's something that I highly recommend. At the Eastside Freedom Library, we like to say that we want to place the past and the present in a conversation with each other. And I know that many of you with us tonight are active in organizing. And one of the things that the Knights of Labor has really stood out for with me, my generation of scholars and activists, is that the Knights of Labor realized that workers were already organized. And the role of the Knights of Labor was to link up these various networks of organization. People who worked in the same place or lived in the same neighborhood, or in the case of African Americans, worshiped at the same church, that there were all these ways that there were bonds among working people and a culture of mutuality or mutual aid, of solidarity that could be drawn into and inform and infuse labor organization. The Knights of Labor had a pretty elaborate code, purposes and essential principles of the Knights of Labor. Every member was given a copy of this to understand what was expected of them and what they could expect of their fellows and sisters within the organization. In Richmond, there were two district assemblies, District Assembly number 84, which was white, and District Assembly number 92, which was African American. But the two assemblies, which brought together workers in different local assemblies, also worked on a variety of projects together, which is what I want to talk about this evening. One of the things the Knights of Labor did was they started their own newspaper, the Richmond Labor Herald, edited by a printer named William Mullen, which appeared weekly. You can see the subtitle, Official Organ of District Assemblies 84 and 92. So the white and black assemblies worked together to support this newspaper. And this wasn't only a newspaper of news, it was also a newspaper that served the movement. So one of the important campaigns that the Knights of Labor in Richmond launched began in 1884 around the issue of convict labor. Now, there was in the city of Richmond a really almost Dickensian state penitentiary, the kind of place that I'm sure that parents would walk their children by and tell them, you better behave or you could end up in this place. It was a way to intimidate people. And the dominant ideology of the elite in Richmond was that something like the penitentiary should be a place where the imprisoned should have to pay for their own upkeep. And so the penitentiary offered space and very, very cheap labor to local entrepreneurs. And one of those major workplaces was a barrel shop inside the penitentiary. Barrels were very important to the Richmond manufacturing economy. Tobacco, flour, iron nails, three of the major products of the local economy were shipped in barrels. And so barrel making was an important part of the economy. Barrel makers were called coopers. And coopers in the free labor market organized and struggled with the goal of earning $2.50 a day. The Virginia State Penitentiary offered imprisoned labor at 25 cents a day, 10 times less. And as the Knights of Labor began to organize in Richmond, they had the very good idea that by picking what issues to organize around, they could build the kind of movement that they wanted to see take shape. And so they weren't just against convict labor. They wanted to support coopers, which was the most racially diverse, skilled trade in the city, because African Americans on tobacco plantations had learned how to make barrels. And as some of them migrated into the city, they brought their skills and knowledge with them. And so coopering was a trade that was almost 50-50 African American and white. But their ability to earn a reasonable wage was being undermined by this convict shop in the penitentiary. And so the Knights decreed in late 1884 that they were going to shut that shop down. And among the white members of the Knights of Labor, there were people who either themselves or were the children of people who had grown up in Ireland. And in Ireland, the movement for independence had developed a tactic that they called the boycott. And so the Knights of Labor said, we're going to use the boycott as a way to shut this barrel shop inside the state penitentiary. Now, one of the things that's always frustrating for a historian like me is when we find the minutes of a meeting, we often find that the actual discussion is not recorded in the minutes. And I can just imagine the discussion at a meeting where someone gets up and says, well, I move that we call for a boycott of the barrel shop in the penitentiary. And someone else at the meeting might say, well, brother, or well, sister, when's the last time you bought a barrel? How the hell are you going to boycott barrels? And so the discussion would have gone on, and they finally decided they were going to boycott flour. Great choice, because every family connected to the Knights of Labor purchased flour. And they were going to boycott all flour that came in a barrel that had been made in the penitentiary. And then someone must have said, Well, we could have even more of an impact if we didn't just boycott the flour, but that we boycott every store that sells flour that's made in a barrel that's made in the penitentiary. Now, the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 would make so-called secondary boycotts illegal. That would have been against the law. And there's an interesting story yet to tell about how the employers tried to fight against this boycott. But my point is also that the newspaper, the Richmond Labor Herald, was used as a tool in the campaign to shut the barrel shop in the penitentiary. And the way the Knights of Labor did this was on the front page of the Labor Herald. After the boycott got going, they would include 2 lists of stores. And one list would be titled, "These are the stores that you should boycott." And the other list would be, "These are the stores that it's okay to shop at." And of course, by picking shopping for a consumer good like flour, the Knights of Labor were also making sure not only that they fought for the wages and working conditions and security of both African American and white workers, but that they were asking whole families, whoever might shop for that family, whether it's the woman in the household, whether it's the children in the household, that it became their responsibility to enforce the boycott. Within a year, the major flour mill, Haxall Crenshaw, who had been using penitentiary-made barrels, announced that they would no longer use barrels made in the penitentiary, that they would buy barrels from unionized cooper shops, and the Knights of Labor had a great victory. They had also deepened and strengthened their presence throughout the city of Richmond and Manchester, to the south, that they had brought thousands of workers together in this campaign. That experience, let me back up and say one other thing. No archives or library kept the Richmond Labor Herald. So it's not at the Virginia State Library, it's not at the Valentine Museum. There is no collection of the Richmond Labor Herald. The only way I was able to find issues of it was there was a lawsuit against the Richmond Labor Herald for promoting a boycott. And 6 months of the Richmond Labor Herald were entered into an evidence box at the Hustings Court. And that was the only way I was able to find this resource. Now, let me go on. Well, say just a little bit more with this image. The big story came right after the victory in this boycott. And that is, in late 1885, Richmond businessmen, city fathers, the Richmond City Council and mayor began to talk about the need to build a new city hall. That at the end of the Civil War, when Jefferson Davis and the Confederates hightailed it out of Richmond, they set fire to the city's main business district, and Richmond City Hall had been burned to the ground. From 1865 to 1885, the city government of Richmond rented a variety of temporary spaces. By the early to mid 1880s, the elite in the South began to sing a new tune that they called the New South. They weren't going to be moaning over the lost cause. They were going to be promoting a new, modern, energized, forward-looking South. And the elite in Richmond said, well, it's pretty embarrassing to be advocating a new South and not even having a city hall. Let's build a new city hall. And the city council and the mayor announced in early 1886 that they were indeed going to apportion the money to build a new city hall, but being responsible, and they didn't say capitalists, but I think that is the way they were thinking and what we can say. We need to build this new city hall as cheaply as we possibly can. Let's find the cheapest materials. Let's find the cheapest labor. Let's put the work out to contract. We'll build that city hall, but we're not going to have to raise taxes or put any pressure on people in order to do it. And the Knights of Labor had just had this great success with the boycott of the Hacksaw Crenshaw flour mill and the penitentiary shop making barrels. And the Knights of Labor began to articulate through the Labor Herald and in their meetings a vision in which they said a city hall should be a monument to what a city is all about. And we think Richmond is all about its working people. And so we think the new city hall should be built out of local material. It should be built by local workers. Those local workers should be employed directly by the city, not by private contractors. They should be employed on the 8-hour day. They should be paid a living wage. And in the language of the day, they said, colored workers should have the opportunity to gain skilled jobs on this project. And they circulated petitions, and 7,000 Richmond residents signed their petition. And they brought it to the city council, and the city council said in a language that we would be, I think, all too familiar with today. The city council said, we would be fiscally irresponsible if we built a new city hall on the terms that you're proposing. And the Knights of Labor responded to the rejection of their petition that they would organize a third political party outside of both the Democrats and the Republicans, that they would run in the May 1886 city council election, that they intended to win, take control of the city government, and build the city hall that they had in mind. Well, brothers and sisters, that's exactly what they did. They organized something called the Workingmen's Reform Party. They ran a slate for city council that was both African American and white. They swept the election. They took control of the city government. And they built what those of you who live in Richmond or have visited Richmond know is an absolutely handsome building. It's no longer the city hall. In fact, I believe it's now a place where a number of nonprofits have their offices. And as I'm very fond of saying, there is no plaque on the building that tells you how it came to be built. We live in the internet age. There is a Wikipedia page for the old city hall in Richmond that talks about the architect, but does not mention the Knights of Labor or the way the city hall came to be built. Now, coincidentally, or perhaps fatefully, In the fall of 1886, the Knights of Labor held their national convention, what they called the General Assembly, in Richmond. And this is an image, a drawing of Frank Farrell, who was an activist in the Knights of Labor from Brooklyn, New York, introducing Terence Powderly, the national leader of the Knights of Labor. To the consternation of the mainstream local media, Farrell was also entrusted with the job of introducing Governor Fitzhugh Lee, who addressed the opening session of the General Assembly. Now, I want to mention that 1 year earlier, in the fall of 1885, the Knights of Labor had held their General Assembly in Toronto, Ontario, and a delegation from Richmond, both white and black, attended the General Assembly, and that the leader of District Assembly 92, the African American District Assembly, a local barber named Joseph Brown Johnson, that Joseph Brown Johnson was entrusted with a really remarkable task at the General Assembly in the fall of 1885. He brought with him from Richmond to Toronto a handmade gavel that had been fashioned in Richmond out of 3 pieces of wood. And as Johnson handed the gavel to Powderly, which Powderly would use to run the General Assembly, Johnson explained that 1 piece of wood in the gavel had come from the lectern at St. John's Church, where Patrick Henry had slammed down his fist and said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Another piece of the gavel came from wood that had been carved from a tree in Appomattox, where Cornwallis had surrendered to George Washington, spelling the end of the Revolutionary War and the coming of American independence. And the third piece of wood had been carved from a pillar at what was called the Old Libby Prison. And as Johnson explained, where the true patriots of our common country had been held during the Civil War. That is where Union Army members who had been captured by the Confederacy and imprisoned in Libby Prison, that the third piece of wood was meant to symbolize that. And the 2 district assemblies had decided to commission this gavel and had selected an African American to present it on behalf of all of the Knights of Labor in Richmond. Let me return for a moment to 1886 and Frank Farrell. Farrell was part of a group of so-called radical delegates who had come from Brooklyn, New York. They had traveled by steamboat from Brooklyn to Richmond. On the steamboat, they had made new friends, actors, and stagehands who were coming from New York to stage Hamlet at the Richmond Theater. And these theater artists invited the Brooklyn delegation to come and see Hamlet. And in the midst of the General Assembly, African American and white delegates to the General Assembly went to the Richmond Theater with passes provided by the theater company. And when the lights went up at intermission and the typical Shakespearean audience looked around and saw African Americans sitting in the orchestra section rather than being confined to the balcony, they called for the police. There was a tremendous uproar. The local media, again, we had headlines. The Knights of Labor stand for race mixing. Today it's Hamlet. Tomorrow it'll be your daughter. The Knights of Labor took a stand for racial equity. When the Brooklyn delegates went to stay at a hotel in Richmond, and the desk clerk told them that their hotel did not admit so-called colored guests, the entire delegation left the hotel and went to stay at Black-owned boarding houses in Richmond. Here we have an image of the General Assembly, some sense from the artist of the presence of African Americans as well as whites. And here we have a photograph of the women who were delegates to the Knights of Labor General Assembly. There was a very significant women's presence in the movement in Richmond and in the organization of the Knights of Labor. Now, how was this possible? 22, 23 years after the end of the Civil War. And as I began to try to make sense out of how was this possible? And it's sort of interesting. I want to just mention as kind of a point of personal privilege as I roll on, that when I first arrived in Richmond to do research, which would have been the summer of 1975, someone at the Virginia State Library actually said to me, "Why is a Yankee Jew coming down here and asking these questions?" So, and as I tried to understand how this movement in the 1880s was possible, I began to peel the historical layers back and began to learn about a very interesting movement called Readjusterism. And again, remember, I'm somebody who wants to put the past and the present in a conversation with each other. So what was Readjusterism about? Well, there was a tremendous depression that began in 1873. And that depression was the worst depression in the United States until the 1930s. And one of the pressures in Virginia was that back in the 1850s, the government of the state of Virginia had gone to great lengths to fund what were called internal improvements, bridges, canals. Sounds a little bit like Biden's Build Back Better. Highways, ways to get goods to Norfolk and Richmond, to get them out on the water and out to markets, either in the North or in Europe. And the way they funded these internal improvements was they floated bonds. And many of those bonds were purchased by British investors. And these were bonds with 20 years before they would begin to become due and to be paid back. And so as the revenues began to decline in Virginia in 1874 and 1875, the government of the state of Virginia began to close schools and cut back on other government-provided services. in order to pay back the bonds. And we again get a discourse from the elite that sounds an awful lot like today. The governor of the state of Virginia, Governor Kemper, said, it's a matter of honor that Virginia should pay back its debts. And African Americans who were only beginning to access public schools and to imagine their children's futures with an education began to see those schools being closed. And they said, you built these internal improvements, these bridges and roads and canals, in order to profit from the unpaid labor that we were performing while we and our parents were enslaved. And they said, we should readjust the debt. Let's tell them the British can get 25 cents on the dollar. And if they don't like it, let them come and invade us. And that led to yet another independent political formation, the Readjuster Party, outside the Republicans, outside the Democrats, African American and white, very active in the city of Richmond. They won several seats on the school board in the early 1880s. And in 1879, they elected their candidate, a very odd former Confederate general named William Mahone. They elected him governor, and he stuck it to those British bondholders, and they reopened schools in the early 1880s. So I discovered that here's a picture of readjuster activists posing, white and black together in the late 1870s. Here's an image of discussing cutting those payments to the British. And here's a picture of a school where African American children were being educated during and after Reconstruction. You know, one of the myths that we often are fed is that at the end of Reconstruction, everything got rolled back. It's not true. Reconstruction ended in 1877, but readjusterism rose in Virginia, and interracial independent politics around working class issues was vibrant in the city of Richmond and in the state of Virginia. One of the interesting things that I came across in my research was that when Richmond fell, and so here's an image of Abraham Lincoln marching into Richmond. We have to be suspicious of some representations that, in fact, what happened, and here we have the city being burned, but what actually happened on April 4th, 1865, when the Union Army took Richmond, ahead of President Lincoln arriving to be celebrated and praised, the Union Army was led by the Massachusetts 54th, an African American brigade. And they included formerly free and formerly enslaved African Americans. There is a goosebump generating story in the book Been in the Storm So Long by the historian Leon Litwack. Litwack describes the Massachusetts 54th. He uses a book that was written by Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was a leader in the Massachusetts 54th. And he quotes the chaplain, Garland White, who had been enslaved and had escaped and made it to Massachusetts, became a chaplain, joined the Union Army, was part of the invasion of Richmond. And Garland White tells the story that the Massachusetts 54th marches into the city. Of course, the Confederate government is running out, setting fire to the city on the way out. And they come to Lumpkin's slave jail, where enslaved African Americans were held, waiting to be taken to the auction block, where they would be sold away from their loved ones, women away from men, men away from women, parents away from children, children away from parents. And Garland White writes that as they began to approach the jail, they could hear enslaved men and women and children singing, "Slavery chain done broke at last, done broke at last. Slavery chain done broke at last. Gonna praise God till I die." This was the energy of the fall of the slave regime in Richmond in April 1865. Now, we come back to this image. Very interesting argument would go on over the next decade. The Republican Party in Richmond, which claimed to represent African Americans, wanted to celebrate January 1st as Emancipation Day. That was the date in 1863 when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But African Americans in Richmond said, we got free on April 4th, not January 1st. You know, we've just had Juneteenth declared a national holiday. Lots of Americans are getting an education about the ways, plural, the ways that slavery ended because of this new interest in Juneteenth, when enslaved men, women, and children in Texas were finally freed in June, mid-June of 1865, months after the end of the war itself. Here we see newly freed African Americans celebrating their holiday of Emancipation Day on April 4th. Here we see the first cohort of African Americans elected to the Virginia state legislature in 1869. Through my research, one of the great resources for me was the records of the Richmond branch of the Freedmen Savings Bank. And there I found the records of thousands of individuals who took out bank accounts, and the records of over 400 so-called secret societies, fraternal and benefit organizations, and nascent unions that African Americans organized in Richmond between 1865 and the Depression that began in 1873. Many of those men and women had worked at the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, both African American and white. Some worked in local tobacco factories, and some women also worked in cigarette factories and plug or chewing tobacco factories. Remember, I said earlier about the Nights of Labor Awareness that people were already organized. Labor historians will do weird things to try to squeeze information out of meager sources. I learned from a wonderful African-American historian named Dennis Dickerson, who was writing a PhD dissertation about African-American migration from Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, to Pittsburgh, where we were in graduate school. And Dennis had this brilliant question and then a brilliant insight about how to answer the question. So his question was, when did African Americans who had migrated to Pittsburgh think that they now lived in Pittsburgh for keeps, and it was worth organizing there to try to make their lives better? And Dennis got this crazy detective idea of looking at obituaries in the Pittsburgh African-American newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, to see what did African-American families do with the bodies of their loved ones when they died. And was there a moment, I'm so old, this is back in the day of these gigantic computers and punch cards. And Dennis is feeding this information onto punch cards and into this giant computer. And one morning he comes into the room that the graduate students shared in the history department, and he says, I've got it. He said, it's September 15th, 1927. Excuse me, when the tipping point, when a majority of African Americans are being buried in Pittsburgh rather than being sent back to Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And Dennis gave me the idea to look at obituaries. And I found, to jump back to the 1880s, that one of the things the Knights of Labor did was they buried their members. And obituary notices in the 1880s included the list of pallbearers. And so, like a crazy detective, I began to make a list of every 7 people, the one body in the casket and the 6 people carrying it. And then I went to city directories and manuscript census and whatever other sources I could find to ask, what did these 7 people have in common? And I found that they always had something in common. They lived in the same neighborhood. They worked in the same factory. They worshiped in the same church. There was something that bonded them together. And then they brought that network into the Knights of Labor. And that's what I see in these images from immediately after the Civil War. Here we see a protest by white workers in the early 1880s, drawing parallels between the slavery of the past and the slavery of the present. That they were going to unite with African American workers to organize together to stamp out the slavery of the present that they were experiencing. Here is the City Hall. No news to those of you, obviously, who live in Richmond. But I keep it, what a beautiful, beautiful building. There were hand-carved gargoyles at every point on the roof. When I first saw the building, I thought, some people got the job to carve those gargoyles because there was a labor movement that brought African American and white workers together to build the City Hall the way they thought it should be built. Okay, we come back now. My point about the Robert E. Lee statue is that the elite working particularly with the Daughters of the Confederacy, raised the money beginning in 1888 to construct a statue to Robert E. Lee to reinvoke the so-called myth of the lost cause and to try to drive a wedge between those African American and white workers who had taken over Richmond city government. In 1887, the Workingmen's Reform Party had branched out from Richmond into the entire district, running a third-party candidate for Congress. The third-party candidate was none other than the editor of the Richmond Labor Herald, William Mullen. And Mullen went throughout the district with an African American on one side of him and a white worker on the other side of him. And both the Democratic and Republican parties launched into a disinformation campaign to try to split white and black workers from each other, to undermine Mullen. And building the Robert E. Lee statue was part of that campaign as well. They would ultimately be so successful that by 1902, a Virginia Constitutional Convention would be convened, and that Constitutional Convention would institute ways of, and here we are again with this conversation between the past and the present and familiar ideologies and narratives, that this new constitution would suppress the African American vote by introducing a grandfather clause, that you could vote only if your grandfather had had the right to vote, a poll tax, which effectively disenfranchised poor white people as well as African Americans, and a so-called educational test, which, as we have found documents about these tests, they were always oral. Someone arrived to register to vote, and the clerk would ask a question about the Virginia Constitution and then tell the person who wanted to vote, sorry, that's the wrong answer, come back next year. And by the middle of the first decade of the 20th century, most Virginia African Americans had been stripped of the right to vote. And the Richmond that many of us would become more aware of in the 20th century, that would ultimately stand against school integration in the 1960s, that new Richmond was being built. But this, brothers and sisters, this is the Richmond that you are creating, that we see in this immense mass of human beings surrounding the statue of Robert E. Lee, which of course now is no longer there. But this is the future. And so I'm going to try to escape from screen sharing. Let us see. Yes, stopping was easier than starting. I'm going to stop there and hope that I've provoked you to think of some questions or comments. I would love to hear from you. Adam, do you want to moderate this?
Sure, yeah, I'll keep an eye out in the chat here. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat and we'll read them off. Just want to thank you for giving that very elaborate presentation, very inspiring stuff. Feels very pertinent to, the Virginia worker. I didn't even know about this stuff.
Well, I think it's criminal that this is not a history that is taught And it's not a history to make people feel bad, guilty, that my great-grandparents treated somebody else bad. Shit, it's that they organized together, and that together they were able to build that beautiful building, that together they were able to close the barrel shop in the penitentiary, that together they were able to elect women delegates to the General Assembly of the Knights of Labor, that what they were able to accomplish together is what is so scary to the elite in Virginia, throughout the United States. There's my brother, Donald Miner. Hello, Donald. What a treat to see you.
Okay, we got our first question here.
Great.
Do you think there was anything the working class movement could have done differently to triumph over the racist anti-worker backlash in the late 19th century?
Yeah, that's really the important question. And I tried to wrestle with it in the conclusion to my book. And my argument was that the movement did not create spaces where rank and file members of the Knights of Labor would mingle with each other. And so while the leadership created a program and the membership enforced the program, that rank and file African Americans, men and women, rank and file white members, men and women, did not socialize together. And so when a demagogue politician like George Wise in 1887, when a redneck newspaper like the Richmond Dispatch in 1887 said, Black workers are this, this, and this, or encouraged African Americans to think of white workers as this, that, and the other. Too few rank and file members had lived experience with each other so that they could counter what was being pushed at them by politicians and by the media. And so one of the things that we are committed to at the Eastside Freedom Library in St. Paul is creating a space where the descendants of the European immigrants interact with the newly arrived immigrants from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Mexico, Guatemala, Ecuador, that I think that the lesson for me has been, what can I do so that people meet each other, listen to each other's stories, and feel that they're in a space where it's safe for them to tell their stories. And I think the Knights of Labor did not go that far, and that left them vulnerable to the manipulation and machinations of the elite, who spun narratives and ideologies to turn them against, to at least make them suspicious of each other, if not turn them against each other.
Yeah, Beth commented that the old City Hall building has a plaque about Cutshaw, the engineer, but not the workers.
Yeah. Well, I wrote an article about the statue, about the Robert E. Lee statue, which talks about City Hall and that there should be a plaque on City Hall. I sent it to the Times-Dispatch. No one even replied to me. I sent it to the Washington Post. No one even replied to me. Fortunately, the Progressive magazine in Madison, Wisconsin, was willing to take the piece and put it in their online publication. But, it's both confirming my argument and very frustrating that if I say history is hidden and then I'm ready to tell the hidden history and the motherfucking gatekeepers won't let the story out. And so it stays hidden. And people think white people and black people in the working class have always been at each other's throats. And there ain't nothing that we can do about it. That's why we need to challenge all this resistance to the way history ought to be taught.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of parallels between now and then, especially in regards to, who has media, who has the easiest ability to spread information or disinformation. And that just makes me think, like, how crucial was their newspaper, the Knights of Labor newspaper, and like trying to combat that.
Yeah. And how interesting that no professional historical organization or library has kept that newspaper. So, let's even erase the documents of the past.
There was a question from Guy. He's saying, in your research, did you discover any evidence of influence from Marxism in this early period of interracial mass labor movements in Richmond? Was there familiarity with or attempts to contact the international workers' movements?
So I did find that in the 1890s, after the movement was already beginning to decline, that one of the guys that I was very interested in, named John Taylor Chappell, that John Taylor Chappell joined the Socialist Labor Party. And there was a little chapter of the Socialist Labor Party in Richmond. And it's really a great little research story so this was back in the day when there were still card catalogs and everything wasn't electronic. And I found that the Virginia State Library had a journal of John Taylor Chappell's. And then I thought, wow, it was an amazing source. And I was also curious, how did they get it? And so one of the things that was amazing about it as a source was that it included the minutes of something of a part of the Knights of Labor that was called the Knights of Labor Cooperative Building Society. And John Taylor Chappell, who would become Socialist Labor Party, John Taylor Chappell had been the secretary of the Knights of Labor Cooperative Building Society. And in his minutes, he goes through debates that they had in the organization about whether African Americans should be invited to join along with whites. And some of the whites said, here's the plan was everybody pays dues. And every time the dues accumulation reaches $100, we put the name of every member in a hat and we pick a name out of the hat and he gets the $100. And the idea was $100 is what it took to buy a building lot. And so some of the white guys said, wow, what if a black guy's name gets pulled out of the hat? He's going to get the money that we've put together. And somebody else said, well, what if a black guy's name gets pulled out of the hat and he wants to use it to buy a building lot in what has been an all-white neighborhood? And this was a little pocket where people actually hammered out these issues and ultimately decided everybody should be treated the same, that African Americans as well as whites would have an equal chance to be picked. Everybody paid the same dues. somebody who had been in for 5 years would have the same chance of winning as somebody who had been in for a month. And Chappell he was a wagon maker, so kind of a carpenter with specialized skills. So I went wild when I found this notebook. And then I looked at the card catalog, and it said that it had been donated by his son, Warren Chappell of Norwalk, Connecticut. So remember, again, this is 1975, almost 50 years ago. And I was the Yankee Jew from New England. I was living in Massachusetts. I drove back up Interstate 95. And as fate would have it, Interstate 95 went right through Norwalk, Connecticut. So I pulled off the road, went to a phone booth. You guys remember there used to be something called phone booths. And I went to the phone booth, and there was a phone book in the phone booth. And lo and behold, Warren Chappell was in the phone book. And so I called him up. And he said, come on over. And I went to his house, and I not only learned more from him about his father, but also found that he himself was a woodcut using book illustrator. And his proudest product was an edition of Moby Dick, in which he had created all of these woodcut images. I was just like, it was like magic. So Chappell, as I learned from his son, organized a small local of the Socialist Labor Party. That's the Daniel DeLeon group that many labor historians see as the forerunner to the IWW. And DeLeon was also very much a Marxist. And so there was some of that present, at least by the 1890s in Richmond.
Mary made the comment that some of the issues of the Labor Herald are now online at virginiachronicle.com from 19.
At Virginia, what, virginiachronicle.com?
Yeah.
Wow. All right. Thank you, Mary. That'll be fun.
Here's a good question from Kevin. He says, it seems like there's a bit of papering over the fact that the white working class has actually had a significant reactionary contingent. How is the black working class expected to build interracial class solidarity when there was good reason to be suspicious of all white people? What is the responsibility of the white left to really spearhead efforts to build interracial class solidarity?
I mean, that's a hard question. I realized that one of the things that I was doing in my research was I was looking for non-racist white workers. And I found a couple, John Taylor Chappell being one, a guy named Daniel Alley who lived in the East End and was a carpenter, was another. I remember this moment after the book came out. I was at a labor history conference in Madison, Wisconsin, and there was this really fascinating, very cantankerous character named Herbert Hill. And I found myself, I was fond of him because he was Jewish. Herbert Hill had been the NAACP's labor secretary from the 1940s through the late 1960s. And I realized that what his job had been is that he got mail from African-American workers. So, this is before the internet, before cell phones. People are writing letters to the NAACP telling horrible stories, how badly they've been mistreated. And imagine if your job was day after day reading these letters. And so Herbert Hill became a very crabby guy. And I met him at this conference. It must have been 1981, 82. And he said to me, he pointed at me, and he said, "You're the guy that's written the book that says Black and white workers were able to organize together in Richmond. Don't you realize you provide just as much evidence in your book that they couldn't stick together as you do that they did organize together?" And I was pretty quick-witted. And I said, if you'll grant me that it was possible for them to organize together, then the 7 years of work that it's taken me to write the book was worth spending, that it was possible. And I think that we have to, in 2022 and going forward, we have to operate in the realm of what's possible. And we can't assume that people will always do dirt to each other, that we can find the examples in which people are bigger than what they were raised to be. And how can we tell those stories to others so that they too can imagine themselves being bigger than they were raised to be. And it's been hard in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the rise of a very angry racial justice movement. And this has been a hard time to talk about solidarity. And I think that we need these kinds of examples to show that it's possible to organize together. Because alone we're screwed. Alone we're never going to get anywhere.
That's a good lead into this next question here. Someone asked, what can Virginia workers do today to build power and solidarity like and better than the Knights of Labor?
You tell me. You know, I've been picking Adam's brain about what's going on with the Target Workers United. Here we are in the Twin Cities. We're like the headquarters for Target. And I don't hear stories about Target workers organizing. We did just have workers at 4 half-price bookstores have just unionized. Workers, I'm just beside myself with excitement that workers at 36 sites of the Minnesota Historical Society have just unionized. The Minnesota Historical Society is older than the state of Minnesota. And now the workers have organized. Wow. You know, so we need to find these examples, find ways to tell these stories. We need to pressure school systems. You know, we can't just give up because the rednecks are demanding that we not teach this history in the schools. We have to take them on everywhere and push to tell these stories. And I'm sure, like the movement around the Robert E. Lee statue, look at the creativity, the use of projections, the use of graffiti, the massive turnouts of people. It's, you know, you have accomplished a great deal already that people would have said, you can't, that'll never happen. You can't. The people that put that Robert E. Lee statue up in 1890, they thought it would be there forever. Now you got to get a plaque on City Hall.
All right, here's a question from Gary. He says, can you discuss the type of internal process, consciousness raising, debates, and or strategic clarity and debates that allowed for this multiracial working class movement to decide it was in their interest to get behind a former Confederate general as a gubernatorial candidate, and any lessons you think we should take?
That's a great question. I'm not sure that we have the resources to enable us to really flesh that out. There was a book called there's been a couple of books on the Readjusters, one by a pretty good historian named James Tice Moore, one by a guy named Pearson. I don't think they ask a lot of these questions about what's happening on the ground. I think that John Taylor Chapel's notebook tells us a lot more, really tells us what people were saying and doing at meetings. Mike is suggesting Jane Daly's book on the Readjusters. I'm going to write that down. I don't know that book. Great. I think that part of what we're trying to do at the Eastside Freedom Library and other people that I know of around the country, we're trying to use oral history. You know, can we find people who were in struggles, get them to tell their stories? I'm working with a wonderful guy right now whose dad was in the 34 Minneapolis Teamsters strike, and before that was in the IWW. And this guy is writing a memoir, trying to recreate as best he can what were the stories that his father told him about what the 34 Teamsters strike had been like. I think that, you know, we live in a culture that has made many people feel that their stories don't matter, and that there's no space to tell them in. And I think the kind of intellectual revolution in American history that started in the late 60s and began to use oral history. And I think some of the work that's being done in creative nonfiction and even fiction, trying to imagine what might have gone on in meetings, what might have gone on in movements. I think of a book like The Known World. Do you know the novel The Known World, which is set during slavery in Virginia? The author, I forget his first name, is Jones. And it's about the tensions between men and women within the slave community, tensions between free Blacks and enslaved African Americans. It's a very interesting trying to imagine. I'm in the middle of reading, I think, the longest novel I've ever, and I use the word picked up kind of generously. It's 800 pages long, called The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, written by an African-American woman. It's a challenging read, but she's really bringing us into the inner lives of people who lived a generation or two before us. And I think that, you know, in a country like ours, you know, that began with genocide, that then continued with the horrible brutalization and exploitation of enslaved African Americans, that I think it's so foundational in the United States that white people, whether they were the descendants of Pilgrims and Puritans or whether they were later arrivals like my Eastern European Jewish ancestors, that we all had to swallow a story that it was okay to treat other human beings in horrible ways, that somehow that they were not as human as we were. And that has so poisoned imaginations that the work that lies ahead of us is not only organizing work, but also the work of letting imagination loose and allowing us to go back and rethink how relationships might have been and how people might have understood themselves. And we have a huge job ahead of us to do that kind of work. And yet I'm inspired every day by people that I meet who are doing exactly that. Poets, visual artists, musicians, storytellers. And we have to imagine a movement that encompasses all of that. It certainly isn't only about wages and benefits. It's about all of that. And it is, as someone was saying earlier, about power. The power to imagine ourselves outside of the dominant structures and strictures that have been created for us.
Beth was wondering if you knew about any of the WPA interviews, maybe if they would have some of those stories.
The WPA interviews are great resources. So in the Great Depression, the New Deal, the kind of thing that Biden has not proposed, but the federal government created jobs for unemployed artists, for unemployed graduate students, and created a project called the Wpa Slave Narratives that relied on these gigantic tape recorders. People were sent into the South. Zora Neale Hurston was an interviewer in the WPA Slave Narratives Project in Florida. More than 2,000 narratives were collected. The wonderful George Rawick kind of discovered the tapes. So as lots of government projects, it was great to put people to work. It was great to collect the stories. And then there was no plan about what to do with it. And so they got put on a shelf at the Library of Congress. Nobody looked at them for 30 odd years. In the 1960s, as the civil rights movement began to blossom, as Black power began to emerge, scholars began to look at the way the story of slavery had been told. One of the dominant books about slavery was written by a Jewish scholar, Stanley Elkins, who argued that the best way to understand slavery was to study concentration camps, and that Jews had not resisted in the concentration camps and enslaved men and women had not resisted on the plantation. In fact, he was wrong on both fronts, as we now know better. But when people said, look at what Black people are doing on the streets of Birmingham, on the streets of Memphis, on the streets of Richmond, all over the country, how can they stand up if their ancestors didn't stand up? They must have stood up. How can we find out? And all the history of slavery up to that moment had been written by relying on the journals and diaries kept by the enslavers, kept by the planters. And so George Rawick, who himself had been sort of on the side of C.L.R. James in the 1940s in Detroit, and Rawick said, we gotta find a way to find how enslaved people understood their own experience. And then he must have had one of the biggest holy shit experiences that any researcher ever had. He finds these 2,000 oral history interview tapes at the Library of Congress, sitting there molding and falling apart. And George starts a project of restoring the tapes, and getting them transcribed. You can access most of them on the internet now through the Library of Congress. And George writes an introduction to I think it's like 65 published volumes of the WPA Slave Narratives. And George's introduction is called From Sundown, it's called The American Slave, From Sundown to Sun Up, The Making of the Black Community. And he understood that in their time, outside of the gaze of the enslavers and the overseers, enslaved African Americans created their own world. And he writes an introduction to that and argues that the slave narratives give us the opportunity to listen and experience those stories. So it's great. The WPA slave narratives are remarkable.
Jay commented that if there isn't an audiobook version of your book, Black Labor in Richmond, that you should record one.
Uh-huh.
And Guy had another question here. I guess he's wondering if there's any kind of continuity or influence between the Knights of Labor organizers and, the Communist Party when they organized the tobacco workers and their strikes in the 30s.
I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. I think there's some very good work on the tobacco workers. Bob Korstad has a great long article about civil rights unionism. I think when we look at, I've been very interested in the packing house workers, and we see, the role of African American women and men in Chicago in the packing house workers, in Omaha in the packing house workers. Some of those people surely were the children of people who were in the Knights of Labor or were themselves in the Knights of Labor. I'm sure that this lore gets handed on. I entered the movement in the 60s, and people like me, people around me, we spent a lot of time looking for people who had been in the 30s, looking for people who had been in the strikes in the 30s, the sit-down strikes, the mass strikes like the Minneapolis Teamsters strike. I'm sure that when people begin to organize, they look for people from those earlier generations. And I think those of us who are now becoming elders, we have to learn not to dismiss the young, that we have something to offer, but we don't have all the answers. We messed up too. So it all comes along.
Yeah, I mean, even the Communist Party, I didn't even know they really had a presence here until I started trying to dig that out myself. Thankfully, there were some references in Richmond Times-Dispatch, and there was a much more vibrant movement then. And it seems like maybe they were organizing on more hostile grounds with segregation in effect. That was one of the big things they fought against versus this time period you're talking about. It seemed like maybe there was more movement, which leads me into my question about, do you think the labor laws at the time of the Knights of Labor were less restrictive than the labor standards and laws we have today?
Absolutely. There wasn't the Taft-Hartley Act. I was saying we just had this conversation on Sunday with bookstore workers, including, as I look at my brother Donald, people connected to the Politics and Prose bookstore in DC, which has recently organized. And I intervened, playing moderator, and said, well, there are 124 half-price bookstores around the United States. we live at a time where the National Labor Relations Board could say, you can't organize in these 4 stores until you've organized all 124 stores. They could say that. There are issues in the half-price bookstores with who's really management and who's a worker. There are people called, I'm not sure if they call them shift leaders. There's a whole, ladder of give people a little bit of status. And again, the National Labor Relations Board, as they did in the 1930s, came along and said, well, foremen can't be in the same union with line workers. They got to be in separate unions. And what I heard these bookstore workers describing was that they just went ahead and organized. And they talk about building relationships, and they talk about solidarity, and they talk about their relationships with customers. And it may well be that bookstore workers are in a particularly great spot because the customers tend to be pro-union, and the customers appreciate the knowledge that the workers share with them. But they just are going ahead and organizing. And at some point, the National Labor Relations Board, or at some point, some pinhead judge that was appointed by Trump, I just heard the other day, I was amazed. Trump appointed 53 appellate court judges in the 4 years that he was president. 53 appellate court judges, 0 Black, 0. I don't remember anybody calling him out for that when he was president. So there are lots of ways the government can intervene through labor law in ways that challenge us. But I think if we keep building relationships, we keep organizing with each other, we can build something that will profoundly change this country. Shall we stop there, Adam?
We can. Did anybody else have any more questions?
Yeah, I don't have a question, but I am going to real quick just drop the Virginia workers' contact information in the chat.
Great.
As well as a contact form for the Communist League of Richmond, if any Richmond area people are interested in that. For the Virginia worker, we are accepting stories, pitches, polemics. So, if you're in Virginia, or even if you're not in Virginia and you think you might have something interesting to write, by all means, just contact us.
Thank you, Mike. And I want to encourage everyone to check out the East Side Freedom Library. We are living in this weird historical moment where we can all be together electronically. You can attend any of our events and activities. Please join us. You can subscribe to our twice-a-month electronic newsletter through our website. Go to the Get Involved header and sign up for our newsletter. It's free. You can email me at info@eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. I would be very glad to hear from you. I have, the book was first published 40 years ago. And I have been invited once to Richmond to give a talk. Unfortunately, that once allowed me to give like 3 talks. It's the only time in my life that I gave a talk in a barbecue restaurant. And that was really a great experience. And I got to eat. But it means a lot to me to be talking with you. You know, I'm kind of this weird in-between person who has soaked up. I do. I like to think of myself as a sponge, and I soak stuff up, and then at the right time in the right place, I squeeze myself and it comes back out. And so I've soaked up your history. I don't want to be a colonizer or an imperialist. I didn't really, frankly, make any money writing this book. So I haven't gotten rich off your history, but tonight is a good opportunity for me to give it back where it belongs. And it means more than I can say to me to be able to share this with you tonight. Let's keep the relationship going, please.
Thank you so much for being willing to do this and taking the time. I know we didn't compensate you anything for this either. And,
yeah,
you know, we're just getting started here, and I think I couldn't think of a better way to start off our first event of the year and first event as a Virginia worker. And you know, maybe you can check out Joe Burns' talk when he presents on his book on February 24th, same time.
Great, because we're going to do an event with Joe also.
Great.
So,
yeah, he said he knew you, so.
Oh yeah, we go way back. Yeah. His book, Class Struggle Unionism, and I encourage you to read it. And he's now an attorney for the flight attendants union. Great.
All right. Well, thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everybody stay tuned. We'll have this up on YouTube and people can review it, and, you know, hopefully more folks can check it out.
Great.